So you've heard it said there's no health without mental health. However, I think that there's another bit to that, and that there's no mental health without healthy sleeping. People think often about sleep as being like a box or a container. You're either inside the container or you're outside of the container. However, sleep's not like that at all. Sleep is, instead of a simple box, sleep is like an entire house. It has an architecture, it has different rooms with different functions. So if you went to your friend's house and you spent the whole weekend there, but you were never allowed to go and sleep in the bedroom, you had to instead try and sleep on the kitchen counter or had to try and sleep on the sofa. You might get the sleep, but the quality of the sleep would be affected. That's exactly the same as how different circumstances, substances, mental ill health and the like can affect sleep. It's like allowing us to get into the house, but we're only allowed into certain rooms. And why is that important? Well, let's talk about first of all the normal architecture of sleep. So whenever we look at sleep, sleep is built up of 90-minute segments. And so people cycle through the same 90 minutes on a regular basis throughout the night. And why is this important? Well, the first half of sleep is normally working sleep, or think of about charging in your device at night and allowing that to charge up to 100%. That's ideally what the first part of your sleep is doing, is charging your device. The second half then is really working sleep. And during that working sleep, we store in long-term memory things that we want to learn and retain. So new learning becomes embedded and available to us, linking in with other functional networks. We also get rid of the information that we don't need. So it might be important that you remember content from your lectures today, but it won't be important that you remember what type of tie the lecturer was wearing. That information is there, so it has to be gotten rid of. So it allows your brain to decide to focus on what's important and what's not important. You have to then have enough time to process that information to put it into long-term memory. So if we look at when that's happening, that information processing is typically happening in a part of sleep that most people have heard of, and that's REM or REM sleep. Now, REM sleep is when a lot of our dreaming occurs, although not only then, we do get some memory processing occurring in slow wave sleep as well. But the problem is that at the start of the night, those first two 90-minute cycles really contain little or no REM. And then by the time you're entering your third cycle, you begin to start to have dreaming, and REM starts to come in, and you get an increasing percentage of REM in subsequent 90-minute cycles. Now, this is important because if you sleep for 6 hours instead of 8 hours, you've lost at least one cycle of sleep. But the percentage of REM that you're losing, you could lose 50% of your REM for that night. Now, this is really important because one, it might mean that you feel a bit more groggy the next day, and that maybe some things that you wanted to try to remember and retain, actually you haven't been able to. On an average night, that information processing function is something that an average person will experience 3 to 5 times. A researcher called Marco Pagani has looked at this, and that same brain state is something that in an average EMDR reprocessing session, we will see 25 to 30 times. So we believe that this is part of why EMDR is so effective and so efficient in the processing of information. Now, we also know now that during rapid eye movement sleep, the spaces between the cells of the brain literally increase, and that the brain flushes itself and cleans out the waste products. Now, this is important because your brain, although it's a part of your body, actually is different to every other organ in your body because it is surrounded by a thing called the blood-brain barrier, which means that it's separated from the rest of the body. That stops some toxic things coming in, but it's like a walled city. It's harder also to get things out of the city. And so that's what happens during REM. And if we aren't having effective and sufficient amounts of REM, that can lead to longer term problems. So if we look at people who are famed for being short sleepers, such as, for example, Margaret Thatcher, I would believe that goes some way to explain why she then developed dementing illness, because the brain wasn't having sufficient amount of time to be able to flush the waste products out of the brain. So sleep's really important in that regard, and the processing of information is really important. Now, Marco Pagani and his team also looked at the slow wave sleep piece, and this is important because the alarm and alert system in the brain and the memory making system in the brain during slow wave sleep pass information backwards and forwards. So if you've had a distressing experience during the day, that will be desensitized and processed, and in a sense the toxicity taken out of it, hopefully, and integration with other learning and resources that you have. That's happening in that phase of sleep. So again, if we're not getting a good night's sleep and we're not sleeping for long enough, then all of those functions become diminished, and so that can cause substantial problems. Now, whenever we think about how a person presents, if we were to deprive you of normal sleep and make you sleep for a short period of time each night, less than was sufficient, we would see a lot of the symptoms that we see in mental illness. So we'd see poor concentration, we'd see reduced motivation, we'd see confusion, and even if it's extended, we would see hallucinations as well. So a lot of the symptoms that people have that we recognize as a part of mental illness actually can be being driven by abnormal sleep. Part of the difficulties that we have is that the medications that people are often given then in the form of the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, that SSRI can interfere with sleep. And the problem that we have there then is a person who needs to be having functional sleep to help them to come to terms with lived experience, that what you can have instead then is a medication which seems to reduce the suffering, but is actually making sleep more abnormal. And so I've been mentored for a long time by Dr. Christopher Tchaikovsky, who used to run the Edinburgh Sleep Clinic. And so often we will look at combinations where medication is used, of perhaps where we need to use SSRIs, of adding in some of the older tricyclic medication at a lower dose, most commonly something like amitriptyline, because that can then help to preserve the normal architecture of sleep. It can allow you to get into the bedroom and get to sleep instead of trying to sleep in the kitchen counter, and that makes a big difference, as you would be aware.